Hello and welcome to Against the Law, the myth-busting ancient history podcast. Each episode, we take a look at something that's going on in the present and peek back into the past to see how ancient societies handled it. If we come across a big misconception about the ancient world, you'll hear a gavel sound, which means we're going against the law to sort the fact from the historical fiction. This episode goes out on Valentine's Day, so we're going to be talking about relationships. Whether you're single and ready to mingle, in a COVID-safe way of course, or snuggled up to a significant other, or whether it's just complicated, you'll probably find that there's a figure in ancient history who can totally relate to your relationship status. I'm Xenia, and I'm going to be covering Roman relationships. If I mention my own paramour, the Emperor Hadrian, you'll hear a sound effect. I'm joined by Barney, who can tell us about what love had to do with the ancient Near East. If he mentions Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, you'll hear a Mesopotamian moo. Flo is here to share the love and learn about the ancient world along with you listeners. So it's all Greek to her, but not to Alison, who is our resident researcher on the ancient Greeks. Even the best love stories can have tragic endings, so if Alison mentions Greek tragedy, you'll hear. So happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Are you doing anything to celebrate?
I've never actually been a big celebrator of Valentine's Day. For the past 5 years, my other half and I haven't done anything particularly romantic. But weirdly, this year, we want to put the effort in because it's like we kind of feel like we deserve a bit of excitement during lockdown. So it might be, instead of sitting on the sofa and watching TV for Valentine's Day, we might sit on the sofa, watch TV, just like dressed up nicely.
Oh, that's cute. With like a top hat kind of level of dressed up, or with
Xenia, calm down. We're not getting the top hats out yet. Just like not pajamas this time, I think is probably the dress code. How about you? What are you up to?
So I normally just make like a fancy pink dessert for Valentine's Day. Maybe I'll just do like a raspberry rice pudding or something.
My mind has instantly gone to aphrodisiacs in the ancient world because of that.
Nando's is a bit of an aphrodisiac for me, to be honest. I'm an easy date. Nando's makes me very happy. Are there any sort of ancient history aphrodisiacs that we can talk about? I think in one episode we talked about gladiator sweat-filled mushrooms, didn't we, Xenia?
We did. There was another food stuff that was quite popular as an aphrodisiac in ancient Rome. It was called silphium, and it was like the wonder herb. It was used in a seasoning in various things as like a part of a herb mix, but it was also supposed to be both an aphrodisiac and a contraceptive. Unfortunately, it's extinct now, so we can't test its properties, but it may have gone extinct just because the Romans used it so much.
Is this the plant, correct me if I'm wrong, is this the plant that is shaped like a heart and the seed pods are shaped like a heart and that's where we think we get the heart shape?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So if you didn't have the power of silphium to hand to woo your significant other with, what's a good way in the ancient world to woo your partner, seduce them?
Well, a classic way might be if you had some sort of ancient instrument like a lyre, you might serenade them.
Like the equivalent of like serenading someone with Wonderwall or something on a guitar.
Yeah, like a kind of Shawn Mendes style seduction,
I've always found that concept very awkward, sort of sitting there while someone plays you a tune. But playing the lyre to someone sounds actually quite romantic. I'd probably be quite enthralled by that if someone played the lyre to me. Was that considered like a very romantic thing to do, or was it as cringy as we think of it now?
Good question. I imagine it's probably just as cringy. But I suppose if you're writing songs about people and it's kind of subtle enough, then maybe that's quite a good way of wooing them, So you're like performing songs as normal, but they're just about someone that you really love in a kind of quite coded way. So Sappho's poetry is actually a really good example of this. She wrote lyric poetry, so it's designed to be accompanied with a lyre. So it's pretty romantic stuff. Sadly, now it only survives in fragments, but it was really popular and also really highly regarded in the ancient world.
I recognise Sappho as the name of a 1920s, this might be wrong, 1920s leaflet magazine for lesbian women that was like an undercover thing.
Yeah, so Flo, it's definitely the term sapphic to sort of imply lesbian relationships is from Sappho. And also, interestingly, the word lesbian is actually related to Sappho. Does anyone know where Sappho was from?
Oh, pick me.
Go on.
Is it the Isle of Lesbos?
It is. It's the Isle of Lesbos, which is a Greek island. So the term lesbian literally kind of means from Lesbos. It's not. It's a term that wasn't kind of coined into the 19th century to mean kind of a gay woman or a woman in a gay relationship. And it's from Sappho because a lot of her poetry is about her love for women.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Alison, what you said about Sappho really reminds me of a Roman poet called Catullus. So he's writing erotic poetry to his mistress, and he has to call her by a code name because she's quite well known in Roman society, and she's actually married as well, so it's very naughty. But what he calls her is Lesbia because he's writing in the same meter, in the same style that Sappho did.
So is that like an Easter egg in the ancient world? Like if you were erudite, you'd know the Sappho reference.
Yes.
Sappho's kind of the OG when it comes to like lyric poetry and romantic poetry. So she's a lot earlier. She's kind of the beginning of the 6th century, which is kind of a long time before the Roman like love elegists are writing. Love elegy kind of being just love poetry of a similar nature. So she's really the one that they're all trying to imitate, which is pretty cool. That the original is like a woman, a queer woman.
That's really cool. And was that considered like cool and fine and acceptable in that culture then?
So that is a really good question. I mean, it says a lot that Sappho only survives in fragments, despite being one of the most popular authors kind of at the time. Her work has suffered a lot kind of in translation. A lot of translators have decided to interpret her work as being heterosexual. So, for example, there's this Sappho fragment that's "Sweet mother, I cannot weave. Slender Aphrodite has overcome me with longing for a girl," which has often been translated as boy or man for kind of no reason other than to make her seem heterosexual, which is obviously totally unnecessary.
Throughout history, do historians have a tendency to downplay gay relationships? Because from my perspective, I know that I've read articles about historical figures, and it's always like this lady lived with her best friend Margaret for 70 years, and they had a huge collection of cats together, and were never seen without one another. And when Margaret died, she went into mourning and never recovered, and they were best friends.
Absolutely, absolutely spot on. It's something that happens in archaeology. So, for example, if archaeologists in the past or possibly even in the present day find kind of two young men who appear to kind of, if it were a young man and a woman, they'd assume that they were a couple, but because it's two young men, they assume that they were just really close friends, they were roommates kind of energy. Sexuality definitely wasn't spoken about in the terms that we use today in the ancient world. They didn't have terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual. So we are imposing our own culturally specific terms on the ancient past when we do categorize sexualities in that way.
So historically speaking, what has survived in terms of what we know about gay relationships or bi relationships?
The very first explicitly homosexual ruler in the world was Roman. He's the Emperor Hadrian. Other rulers may have been homosexual before, in fact, including Hadrian's predecessor, Trajan, but not explicitly. Now, Hadrian was different in the sense that he had a very public relationship with a young man called Antinous. And so last time we talked about statues of Augustus. Well, there are two other statues of Roman men that pop up like literally everywhere. And those other two men are Hadrian and Antinous. So they're really, really recognizable. Hadrian's always with his beard. He brought the beard back in fashion. And Antinous, he's, even objective, he just really is quite stunning.
That's so romantic. So would Hadrian Hadrian have commissioned these sculptures then, because that's ultimate romance, isn't it? I really love you. I've had someone do this extremely flattering sculpture of you, and I'm going to put them absolutely everywhere.
Well, yes. I mean, unfortunately it's quite a sad reason that he had all of these statues commissioned. So they met in AD 123, just 6 years after Hadrian became emperor, in a place called Bithynia, which is northwest Turkey. So that's where we think Antinous was from. They got together in AD 125, and Antinous went on the rest of his sort of big world tour with Hadrian. But when they were on a cruise down the Nile, Antinous drowned in really mysterious circumstances, and Hadrian was absolutely distraught. So he founded a city on the spot where Antinous's body washed up, called Antinopolis. And so he commissioned all of these cult statues and deified Antinous. Again, we talked last time about the emperors being deified after their death. This was really the first time a commoner had been deified. It was quite controversial. That said, it was so popular, especially in Antinous's hometown and in Egypt as well. They loved this idea of this sort of young man who died before his time. It really ties into the myth of Adonis, who was a mortal lover of Venus. And so he almost becomes like a Barbie doll for the ancient world. They dress him up in all of these like local forms of dress. So you've got him in an Egyptian style, you've got him like covered in flowers, and you've got it's really cool. You get all of these different sort of styles of Antinous statues.
That's desperately sad, and yet at the same time it's very bittersweet. I think that's quite an uplifting way to remember someone who obviously Hadrian loved dearly. That's actually very sweet. If I'm just touching wood at the moment, if I die young, I hope my other half founds an entire town where I die.
That's really cool, Xenia. That story of kind of a lover responding to their feelings of bitter grief really chimes with a story from Greek epic, particularly of the mythological figure of Achilles from Homer's Iliad. So the Iliad is set at Troy, which is modern day Turkey, and begins with Achilles being angry at the Greek leader Agamemnon for essentially taking an enslaved woman away from him. So we already have alarm bells ringing about the ethics of this situation. It's basically two enslavers fighting with each other. So yeah, be aware of that. And as a result of this argument with Agamemnon, Achilles basically refuses to fight on behalf of the Greeks, despite being their best warrior. And eventually his close companion, Patroclus, convinces Achilles to let him borrow Achilles' armor and pretend to be him on the battlefield, which you can imagine, because Patroclus is not Achilles, he doesn't manage to do as well as Achilles, and in doing so gets himself killed by the Trojan hero Hector. And when Achilles hears about this, he basically absolutely loses the plot, and for basically the rest of the book goes on an enormous grief-inspired killing spree. And ends up also taking some absolutely brutal vengeance on Hector. So that's a big story. And it definitely raises the question about Achilles and Patroclus's relationship, as evidently Patroclus's death just means everything to Achilles.
I think anyone who's loved anybody, especially in a romantic relationship, when that person is so important to you, you would do anything to avenge them. I go physically red hot if I even imagine somebody that I love dearly coming to any harm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, also, it was kind of canon in the ancient Greek world that they were romantically involved. We actually have evidence, although the tragedy doesn't survive. We have evidence that the ancient tragedian from Greece, Aeschylus, wrote a tragedy about Achilles and Patroclus's relationship called Myrmidons, which included, and I quote from a scholar, Matthew Wright, passionate declarations of love alongside explicit descriptions of sex. So he's really not skirting around the fact that they are like fully erotically, romantically engaged with each other.
That's really interesting, Alison. I know a lot of people have drawn parallels between Achilles and Patroclus, and one of the major heroes of Mesopotamian myth, the hero king Gilgamesh. and his partner in crime, Enkidu. Although I think generally the word on the street is it's a lot more subtle than what Myrmidons might have been. There's been a lot of ink spilled over the nature of the relationship of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. So just a little primer on this. Gilgamesh is like the big culture hero of Mesopotamia. He's an amazing king, and is a terrible king as well. At the start of the Epic of Gilgamesh, he's rampaging over the people of his city, which is called Uruk, which has the reputation of one of the oldest cities in the world. The citizens are scared of him. And he has this kind of rampant sexual energy by which he's exerting his right to sleep with any bride who gets married in the kingdom, which is incredibly problematic. And so the people pray for relief from Gilgamesh in his opening form as this tyrant. And the gods deliver this wild man, Enkidu, who, as opposed to Gilgamesh, who starts off in the city, he appears out in the desert as this incredibly shaggy, hairy, beast-like person. And so you've got this difference between the urban, tyrannical Gilgamesh and the pure, wild Enkidu at the start. But then throughout the epic, their roles begin to converge.
I love the story of Gilgamesh, but that's my nerd side coming through, because Gilgamesh features really heavily in an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation called Darmok. And in that story, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, who's played by Patrick Stewart, has to communicate, but only in metaphor, because the language of the people on the starship that he's been captured by only speak in metaphor. And he retells the story of Gilgamesh almost word for word exactly how you said it, Barney. But he says at the end, they were victorious where they fought the great bull of heaven, but Enkidu fell to the ground, struck down by the gods, and Gilgamesh wept bitter tears, saying, "He who was my companion through adventure and hardship is gone forever."
Oh, that's great. Yeah, so that's the ultimate fate of their relationship is very similar to what Xenia described of the bitter grief of Hadrian and Achilles' response to Patroclus' death as well. It's difficult to overstate how strong the bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is. Gilgamesh has a dream when Enkidu arrives that he falls to earth as this sort of symbolic meteorite. And Gilgamesh, it said he loves it like a wife, and he croons over this meteorite and then this axe in his second dream, which turns out to be Enkidu. And so the strength of their relationship is couched in terms of man and wife, which, for a society as patriarchal as Mesopotamia, is a very strong statement of their love and affection for each other. I mean, they do have a bit of a rocky relationship when they first meet. After Enkidu has been tamed, they have a huge fight. Enkidu and Gilgamesh have this huge fight, and neither emerge as the victor. So they're both these hyper masculine. They're like destroying the temple and shaking the walls as they're fighting. And then neither can beat the other, so they just hold hands and become this amazing, incredibly strong homosocial bond with each other, basically.
I think that's dead romantic.
Well, what's interesting is that when Enkidu dies, which he does, it's their punishment for killing the bull of heaven that you just mentioned. He basically sort of wastes away, and then in turn Gilgamesh wastes away, and he starts wandering the steppe, wandering the desert as not a wild man in the sense that Enkidu was at the beginning, but he loses all of his strength, he loses his luster, he becomes haggard, and people begin to recognize that he's missing something in his life, and this is the result of his loss of Enkidu, and he's pursuing the immortal life at this point, and he never quite attains it, and is by the end of the epic satisfied with dying as a mortal in the way that Enkidu did.
That reminds me of a poem that Hadrian wrote towards the end of his life. It's really sad. He goes, "Little soul, little wanderer, little charmer, where are you off to now? To dark, cold and gloomy places, and you won't make your usual jokes."
That's absolutely heartbreaking.
Especially because it sounds like he had top banter as well.
Is there any way we can lighten things up? I'm feeling very sad.
I've got maybe a seg from like Star Trek. I found it really interesting that you brought up Star Trek, Flo, because I think it's really cool when you see classics used in modern day stories or like sci-fi and often in kind of queer modern day stories. So, for example, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, the famous film by Celine Sciamma that came out maybe 2 years ago now, actually. There's lots of classical imagery of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, which itself isn't particularly a queer myth, but it's used in this lesbian love story. Or, for example, Call Me by Your Name is another queer love story that features a lot of classical imagery, some of which is kind of explicitly queer and some of which isn't. So it's cool to see these stories from classics, which often have such a kind of heterosexual reception history, be kind of used in interesting ways in kind of queer culture in the kind of modern 21st century world.
I was going to say also, it's certainly a breath of fresh air compared to some of the more contentious uses of classical history in the modern world, like by the alt-right, to see it also being used in these positive expressions of love and these, non-heterosexual relationships that have been denied representation for a lot of human history.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, for example, the film about the Iliad, like the most recent film about the Iliad, the 2004 Hollywood film Troy, which features a very ripped Brad Pitt as Achilles, is like unbelievably hetero for kind of no reason, and to the point where it's kind of almost problematic. Like, they develop a romantic relationship between Brad Pitt and an enslaved woman called Briseis, that the one that Agamemnon kind of takes away from him. And the film does so much to paint this relationship as being kind of as ethical as possible under the circumstances, which I think itself is a disservice to kind of the historical realities of slavery and the sexual violence under slavery. But the idea that they could have chosen to focus on this kind of reciprocal, consensual relationship with Patroclus, who's just kind of sitting right there, and instead they decide to make him his cousin. I just really don't understand the logic there. And yet, that's the huge high budget Hollywood film that goes out in 2004.
I guarantee that if there was a film made of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I don't write off, I could definitely see that happening as a big budget CGI, that they would make Gilgamesh and Enkidu like these big bros, ripped dudes, just like out slaying beasts together, smack each other on the back, and not portray any of the kind of sensitivity.
I really like the idea, Barney, that you're so miffed by this concept of Hollywood making Gilgamesh and Enkidu, these dude McBros who go around slaughtering and being super manly and buff. It suggests to me that maybe we should make the epic film, Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Are there any? Is Hollywood just awful and ruining things, or is there any other films out there?
So there was another film that came out in 2004 that is slightly more nuanced in its portrayal of various different types of relationships. It's a film about Alexander the Great with Colin Farrell as Alexander. And, among the relationships that Alexander has, there's one with his sort of childhood best friend, Hephaestion. There's this phrase that becomes quite popular in the ancient world. It happens sort of after quite a long time after Alexander's death, but it is said that Alexander was never conquered except by Hephaestion's thighs. And the film really sort of plays on a jealousy that springs up between Hephaestion and a Persian courtier called Bagoas, who sort of enters into a relationship with Alexander after he conquers most of Persia. And then there's another relationship that Alexander has with his wife Roxanne.
You've actually reminded me, Xenia, of all these relationships with people like courtiers and things like that, of somebody that I read up about on Wikipedia on one of my 2 a.m. Wikipedia binges. Someone called Elagabalus, who I think was a Roman emperor, I want to say. And they were really interesting because they were the first person in recorded history to inquire about having a sex change. And they had lots of very contentious relationships with people in the court, men and women, but also, quite shockingly, I think Vestal virgins. They actually died at the age of 18. They were assassinated by their grandmother which is pretty shocking stuff. I think they were thrown into a river. I have looked it up, and despite the fact that Elagabalus made requests for surgeons to perform sex change surgery, their Wikipedia article is full of he and him, which I think sort of resonates with what we were saying earlier about gay erasure, and I feel like this is sort of trans erasure. We couldn't say for certain that Elagabalus was trans, but so it's just something to be aware of, isn't it, through history, that gay erasure and trans erasure is a thing.
English, let's just say English because we're all speaking in English, can be inadequate translating terms that might intentionally or unintentionally lead to erasure of a vast range of different identities. There's sag, sag, pil, pili, kurga, ra, and all of these, and they've been translated in so many different ways as to remove any nuance about them, because scholars over the years will variously say transgender, eunuch, male homosexual, all of these different things, and none of them work particularly well, and each translator who's tried to apply their own understanding to it is erasing something that will never be reproducible to us, which is the social reality at the time of these people.
I wonder if in the future, when they're doing sort of like a podcast on the iPhone 6000, whether or not they'll talk about our time in history as being the great sort of binary trend, where all nuance was stripped and everyone was this or the other. And it feels like we're starting to build up now more of a language to use to describe ourselves and our identities, our gender identities, our sexual orientations. And I wonder if in the future they're going to be like, wow, these people are so simple.
I've just realised we haven't said against the law at all today.
We haven't.
Well, I feel like this whole episode has sort of been against the law, thinking about relationships in the ancient world and how sometimes we don't even have the language to be able to describe them or translate them today. So, guys, what do you think is the most sort of against the law thing that you've found out today?
I adored Barney's story about Gilgamesh and Enkidu because you're quite right, Barney, that it's so... history has such like a macho patriarchal dude McBro storyline thing going on, and these two guys being so intertwined and such great companions that Gilgamesh wasted away after Enkidu was killed. It's just like, it's super romantic. I love that story.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like, they're still macho, but I just hate the idea that any of the kind of queer potentiality of that story could be underwritten. And in that sense, my best against the law today has been, I really appreciate Alison's insight on Achilles and Patroclus and how that's been twisted in as recently as 2004, with Patroclus being Achilles' cousin, which just sounds so absurd to me, like almost a kind of censoring or taste making. That I found quite surprising.
I really liked how the Epic of Gilgamesh has been retold almost word for word in Star Trek. That's very cool. I like that.
I think it's often really hard to reconstruct the stories of women, and particularly queer women. There were loads of really talented queer women in the past whose stories we don't have. Sappho is exceptional because she is afforded some acceptance by her society, and kind of more importantly, the intervening years between when she lived and us today, which really hasn't been the case for any other female ancient Greek author in the same way.
Thank you for listening. I learnt loads today. I hope you did too. And I hope you have a lovely Valentine's Day. Join us next time when we'll be talking about schools in the ancient world. Bye for now. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Against the Law. If you enjoyed it, hit follow or subscribe so you'll get all our future episodes in your feed. We love hearing from you, so please get in touch with suggestions and feedback on Twitter @AgainstLaw, that's LORE, or email againstthelaw podcast@gmail.com.